Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. My name is Stephen Slota, and here with me is my co-author, my co-host, the brooding wizard of Isengard, who passes the time by pondering his many cursed orbs.
Trent Hergenrader, although you sounded like you had a little bit of a Luigi going on there, like, it's me.
It's me.
It's
we
me.
did that joke before. I don't remember which episode it's in, but we did do the Mario It's a Me before.
They're all running together.
Our long-term listeners will recognize our reference to our previous introduction.
Exactly. It was a vintage episode.
I don't think you could remember what we talked about in the last episode.
You're probably correct. I'm just the talent.
You're just the talent, yeah. This week, we're taking a page out of old Bilbo Baggins' book and retracing our steps, not east toward the Lonely Mountain and Rivendell, but through our respective academic journeys. We thought it would be fun and edifying to provide commentary on which books, articles, and experiences most inspired us to throw ourselves into the smoldering volcano of playful learning, just like Gollum plummeting to his doom, desperately chasing after the One Ring. And there's no need to read into that metaphor about joining an academic community. Some of this will tread territory covered in the Worldbuilding Workshop and our earliest podcast episodes, but a lot of it will be new, and ideally it'll supply resources that you, novice or expert, newbie or old hat, can use to chart the dimensions of your own world-building adventure. And with that, let me hand things over to my buddy Trent, who, being a full decade older than me, had something of a head start in figuring out what it was that appealed to him about the realm of playful learning.
I guess that what I would say is that we were in grad school around the same time. So even though I'm eons older, we were probably contemporarily reading sort of similar things. But as readers of our book may remember, and I think we went over this in one of our earlier episodes, that I was doing research on I wanted to be a writing specialist or have a specialization in writing instruction. And I was looking at digital writing, specifically across the fields of rhet comp and professional writing, and then creative writing. And there was almost nothing in creative writing because I didn't know at this point that creative writing pedagogy had not really been focused on all that much. So that was a feather. One note that I stuck is like, okay, do things about creative writing and digital writing. And then one of my advisors said, well, you know, that all the narrative stuff has probably gone over to games. You should start looking at video games and what they have to teach us about stories and whatever and writing. And then that's when I just sort of fell in. I would say the two books that I got right off the shelf are two books that I will say were absolutely fundamental, were What Video Games Have to Teach Us About Learning and Literacy, which I think, as I've said before, is the book that launched 1,000 careers, right? Or probably more. That's probably not even, it's too low. And then the other one was the book Second Person from MIT Press. It is an edited collection from Nora Wardrip-Fruin and Pat Harrigan. And the full title is Second Person Role-Playing and Story in Games and Playable Media. And both of those got me thinking very fondly about my youth growing up playing all sorts of different types of tabletop role-playing games, but especially the Marvel Superheroes one, which I think I mentioned in any previous episode. That was the one that I went sort of like the heaviest into in my early sort of between years and early teen years. But all of that sort of made sense to me as to how, and I mean, this is the whole thing, like I always say with G's book, is that it really lays out, I mean, this is one of the great misconceptions, is that book does not say you should bring lots of games into your classroom. The central argument, more or less, is games do a really good job of teaching us how to play them. So why isn't learning more like video games, right? Like how games teach you. And I just thought that was a really, that was one of the things that really fired my imagination. And I started thinking about using role-playing games because I was playing Fallout 3 at the same time. And I started thinking, hey, this is a pretty good idea to how can you get students to put themselves in their characters' heads rather than having them come up with a plot and drag their character through it. So I've got lots more to sort of say about what came shortly on the heels of that. But that was really the two that caught my attention and made me realize that there was something there that I could build, you know, ideally a research component. And then it sort of became my career without too much exaggeration. Is like that really pretty much became central to my career. So
did you, before you got to that point where you read Jim G's book, which I also would reference and say is probably central to the synthesis of all of these things that made me pursue playful learning as a field of expertise, Did you feel like that the readings you had done in high school or undergrad or a master's program had any of that teed up the Jim G stuff for you, or do you think of it as being completely separate from what you started investigating when you got to a PhD program?
Yeah, I mean, I was not at all expecting to be doing anything with writing. I mean, basically, I thought I was going to be a fiction writer who would teach creative writing classes, which is kind of what I became. But it's like my research took off more than anything else. But no, I would say that that was something that I was still like in. So I started grad school in 2006, and I don't think it was probably until 2008, 2009, somewhere in that range, when I'd already gotten my master's and was working on my PhD preliminary exams. And I think the thing that sort of led me to it too was a lot of interest in digital literature and digital writing and things like that, because that's also, got some game-like perspectives to it. But I would say it kind of came to me as a bolt out of the blue without having a whole lot of pedagogy training before that either. I mean, most of this stuff happened. I was taking a class in how to teach college composition around the same time, and it was the first time that I ever thought about pedagogy ever. Right. So this is where, again, listeners, you'd be shocked to find out how little pedagogical training I would say the majority of your professors have. And I would argue in a lot of cases, the vast majority of your professors have little to no pedagogical training. And everyone just kind of does the way that I'd approached it, which is I'm just going to do what I've seen professors do my entire life, my entire career. And that's what I will continue to do. And then in this class, it made me think a little bit more critically about pedagogy and what is it that I'm trying to do and what is the point of me lecturing versus them doing things. So all of this stuff was, this is why you go to graduate school, right? Like it was all thrown into the pot and sort of stirring around at the same time. But yeah, I mean, this was a bunch of different worlds that were opening up, so to speak, to me at that time. And I'm sure for you, it was probably a little different because you were a high school teacher, right?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about this even differently than that. And maybe I hadn't put all of these pieces together before right now or before we started talking about doing an episode on this topic. Whenever I tell anyone the story of how I became a teacher or a professor or how I studied playful learning, why that would be a thing, I end up walking them through this journey that on paper seems insane. Like it doesn't make any sense that it would follow one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. But in practice, it did. And the reason why I asked specifically about the readings or the courses you took or anything from high school through graduate school is because I think looking at the lineage of my own readings, the literature that I was immersed in, the kinds of experiences that I was immersed in, there was a really clear logical progression from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. So in taking sort of a survey of all of these things that I was reading at the time, let me backtrack a little bit and say when I was in high school, I was a nerd's nerd, right? Like I was in marching band. I know it's hard to believe that the popular jock that I am, was a nerd's nerd. I was doing drama. I was in marching band. I was the drum major of the marching band. And I was doing a lot of science stuff. And I was very, very lucky. This is not in the book. So this is something new, background for everybody else. Lore, Stephen Lore.
Stephen Lore, good.
My high school
This is one of those books in Skyrim that I would pull off the shelf. Like, Stephen Slow to Lore, like, I'm going to go, hunt some huckleberry or something like that.
You throw it at somebody in one of the towns and just let them do it.
No, I'm really thrilled, and I'm sure I want to hear more.
Well, so here's a shout out to my high school bio teacher, Walt Nakanechny, who was also getting his PhD. Yeah, Nakanechny, yes. Okay. He was my high school biology teacher. He was getting his PhD at the University of Connecticut at the time he was teaching high school bio in my hometown. And I don't know what it was. He and I kind of were on the same level in terms of things that we were interested in. He saw something in me. I don't know what that was, although I can say now as a teacher that there are moments when you're working with students that you just recognize in a student that they have a lot of potential in a certain area, and you want to give them the opportunity to be creative and do something with that potential. He saw that potential in me. And so I ended up working with him at the University of Connecticut through his doctoral program while I was still in high school. And I ended up going to the National Junior Science and Humanities Symposium in San Diego, and I got to visit Mount Palomar, and I got to go to a big banquet where I got to meet scientists who worked with the United States military and different corporations or whatever. And it really opened my eyes as a kid who grew up in a rural part of New England to the possibilities of what I could do with science. And up until that point, I thought I was going to be an animator or an illustrator. I wanted to work for Pixar or Disney. And there were some other circumstances that led to me sort of abandoning that as a career track. Not least of all, I had taken my portfolio to a technical artist at Hasbro who told me, "You're terrible. You'll never make it as an artist," which is a pretty shitty thing to say to a 15-year-old.
Exactly. Well,
it had the effect of making me stop drawing for several years.
Congratulations.
And yeah, and I thought, okay, well, I'll go to college and I'll major in music education because I love band. I want to be a music teacher. And as soon as the prospect of that really was right in front of me, I said to myself, if I do this, there is literally nothing else I'm going to be able to do with this degree. And I don't like the idea of shutting off all of those potential trajectories for myself. So instead, I followed the pathway that had been laid before me when I was in high school to do biology, molecular biology. And so I ended up becoming a genetic engineer, and I worked in a lab at UConn's campus doing genetic engineering work. And that's when I started to realize I didn't love being under a fume hood all day, just replicating mouse cancer cells. It just was not a particularly social. I was not a social person, but it was too antisocial even for me. And I said, this is not going to cut it. So I ended up majoring in molecular bio while also taking a bunch of philosophy courses. And I thought, well, maybe I can marry these two things because I'm super interested in how life evolved. Like that was a really central part of this. I specifically was really interested in DNA and how does genetics determine your phenotype and what are the kinds of ways you can create new life using the technology, quote unquote, of biology. That led me to wonder, okay, so if that's how things work, if there is this biological mechanism that causes people to be, what is the biological mechanism that causes mind? Because that's a completely different thing. Right. It's metaphysical. And I was raised Catholic. I wouldn't say I was a deeply religious person at any point in my life, but around college was when I started really to question, what does this actually mean for me? How do I use religion as a framework to make sense of the world around me? And it became more and more apparent that that was not going to satisfy my desire to understand how the world worked. Specifically, there was a presentation by a guy named Michael Behe who wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. And the entire thing is about intelligent design, which I don't want to platform this book and say it's a really good one. It's actually kind of an anti-example or a counterexample where I read that and immediately thought, wow, this sounds like bullshit. This doesn't make any sense at all. And at the same time, I was reading Carl Sagan's The Demon Haunted World, which is sort of the antithesis of that, which is basically humans through all of human history have used myth, fable, storytelling, superstition to explain things that they just didn't have good information about. And that was paired with a philosophy of science course I took with my then roommate about how did science come to be? What was the Enlightenment era to scientists? And ultimately, how did scientists begin to make sense of falsification? So we were reading Karl Popper and we were reading Chalmers. And again, this fed into my desire to understand what is consciousness? What is identity? How does that fit with this biological genetic model? Because that doesn't explain it to me. Like if you have DNA does not explain why you have a sense of self or an internal monologue. Right. And more importantly, it didn't explain what life was like for other organisms, whether or not they also have some metaphysical mind. That was something that was sort of a monkey on my back for years. Like I really, really wanted to know the answer to that and could not get a satisfying resolution. When I became a teacher, I started writing my own essays about education and some of the frustrations I was having with it. I originally thought I would put them all together into some book called The 7 Deadly Sins of a Good Teacher. And it was going to be like, here are all the things you're told never to do in education, but also these are really good for education, like bringing in pop culture and trying to use games in the classroom. And I didn't have a great foundation for writing any of that. And having looked back at it, it's not good. Like, there was a lot of room to improve, but importantly, it set me up to be able to reconnect with Mike Young and Roger Travis, both of whom we've interviewed, who were professors that I had when I was an undergrad and a grad student getting my master's degree. Their input is what allowed me to start to see the connective tissue between the things I was interested in high school and undergrad and the things I knew I was now interested in as a practicing science educator. And as soon as I found out about their Video Games and Human Values initiative, I thought, okay, this is the perfect opportunity for me to finally get an answer to that question I wanted to answer about why is there such a thing as human cognition? Why is there a mind if all of life is dependent on this physicality of DNA, genetic material, and the various proteins that are generated through transcription and translation? So as soon as I started graduate school, similar to my experience with Walt Knockneckney, Mike Young, I think, identified my curiosity about this and started pointing me at a bunch of different readings that he thought would help sate my desire to understand this. The most important of which ended up being Jerome Bruner, who his entire framework was about narrative psychology and how humans tell stories to make sense of the world around them. It was heavily constructivist. It was all about narrative pedagogy and how you can use storytelling to teach people or to create beginning, middle, and end structures that would organize information for them. It was very scientific or logico-scientific, where the entire thing was about seeking universal truths and formal logic and using categorization. And if any of this is sounding familiar, it's because this is all the stuff that ended up making its way into world building. So to your point about when we kind of met in grad school, we kind of did arrive at the same place at the same time, but from completely different pathways. It's just that I was interested in world building or narrative as a way to understand human consciousness and cognition. You were coming at it from this creative writing perspective that was trying to explain how do you structure a story and then teach people about this process.
Yeah. As you were talking too, I was thinking, well, you know, it was funny because we were prepping for this. I was going back through and looking through my old reading lists or whatever. And my main area for my prelims for my PhD was unstable realities, right? And it was basically like, why do we pretend that there's one reality when this, you know, it was reading a lot of magical realism and things that were pushing back heavily against sort of colonial mindset, you know, scientification of everything like that. And it was very much that different people experience the world in different ways, right? In different cultures, you know, and whatever. And that was definitely in the back of my mind as to why I wrote and liked writing speculative fiction. Why would you bring in fantasy elements or science fiction elements? Well, it's to kind of ruffle the hair of what you think reality is or could be. And if reality was different in some way, how would people react differently? So that's where, you know, for me, it was like, oh, well, teaching. But yes, thinking about, can we all just assume, this is one of my early sort of like early critiques of the creative writing workshop. If we're going to critique a world or a story, we got to all understand the rules of the world of that story. And do we all understand the world of the rule? You know, the rules of that, even like in contemporary literary fiction, where it's like, oh, it's, you know, someone brought a gun to a party or the other things that, you know, students would write about or whatever. And I'm like, wait a minute, like it matters who the character is and their race and their class, and it matters where it is, right? Like none of this stuff had really sort of congealed yet in my head. But that was very much in the background is, shouldn't we have to foreground how we think reality works, regardless of whether we're doing realism or science fiction or fantasy, because there is no one stable world that is the assumption. And that was where, too, like this stuff with creative writing studies was very much about bringing tools from rhetoric and composition to think about bigger picture than the finished product, but like the whole process of where do you get, you know, your imagination, where's your imagination come from, what are the assumptions that you're bringing to a text, all that kind of stuff, basically plugging everything into the, you know, powder keg or whatever. It's like it was all there, and it was totally unintentional, right? And I think this happens to lots of people when you're in grad school, totally unintentional. And then you're like, hey, wait a minute, I taught that one class where I'm like, role-playing games would be great, where we built a post-apocalyptic version of Milwaukee. And that's when I realized, oh, wait a minute, I'm just replicating the same problem. Nobody here, we know post-apocalypse is the genre and Milwaukee is the setting, but there were very different takes on what that city would have looked like and felt like and been like or whatever. And that was 2011, spring semester of 2011, in which I was thinking that is something that I need to look more into, because it was basically collaborative and, you know, interactive and nonlinear and whatever. And then the world building part is the part that came in on the backside, of which it's like, wait a minute, the world really has a lot to do with the way that we view conflict and how we approach it. And then it was all sort of downhill from there in terms of, you know, getting more and more into the you know, writing aspects. And then basically what I was doing in those earliest years too is looking at how, you know, there's a book, What If, where it's just a bunch of different writing prompts. I'm like, oh, well, you could stick these writing prompts into a card game. You know what I mean? Or it's like, you know, and this is where you start seeing that's where, you know, a game like For the Queen, where you're just drawing cards, reading a question, and then answering what your character would do when you're generating your character in that minute. There were a lot of like exercises from the 80s and 90s that were just doing that only with prompt books, right? And I'm like, oh, well, it doesn't take a whole lot to start thinking about how you could add those, had some mechanics to it, and that becomes a game, right? And then, so all that stuff is sort of like swirling around at the same point where I'm starting to get back into understanding tabletop role-playing games as a storytelling medium, and all those other things. And then it just kind of took off from there. Where then, you start meeting people like you, and, other folks at GLS and other kinds of projects. I think one of the reasons why that interdisciplinarity kind of conference worked is because everybody was starting with the same games and learning, or pretty much approximate, like what games and learning are about and what they're for. And that was what united everybody. And then you could go talk to a biologist, or you could go talk to a political scientist. And it just made me keep thinking about more and more ways that you could add structure to otherwise pretty loose sort of objectives in a class, right? You provide the structure, the rules, and then it's very playful and very gameful. And I mean, literally, it hasn't stopped since 2011, right? Like, this is basically the approach that I take to almost every class that I teach.
There's something very postmodern about the way that you describe your, I guess, growing awareness of all of these things.
Yeah.
Do you remember the first time you read a book that really caught your attention in this way? Like, wow, I'm really enraptured by the way this world is constructed, or I'm really curious about how the author connected all the pieces of that world to be able to tell some kind of story that critiques the system as opposed to just being about a character,
Yeah, Perdido Street Station by China Mieville is one of my all-time favorite books, and it's in his Bass Lag trilogy. But the first book, the Perdido Street Station, just takes place in the main city, New Crobuzon, and it's just like a global city like New York City or London or Paris or whatever, which it has very distinct areas around the city. And there's a part in it as well at the end, where towards the end, it's probably about 2/3 of the way through, where they meet up with some mercenaries and they ask them, like, why are you involved with this? And they say something quite literally like, it's just for the gold and the experience, right? And it was basically China Mieville giving a nod to his own sort of explorations in tabletop role-playing games and how those had inspired him. And that was, for me, so many of those things as a work of fiction brought it all together, where the characters were, very diverse from very different areas, had very different reasons for being there. And then every time you moved every few blocks to a different neighborhood, then everything would change very dramatic. It's all one big city, and it's the same thing. Like in LA, you can go from Rodeo Drive to Compton and Watts within about 10 minutes, right? And it's like the difference between those neighborhoods is really, really stark. But somehow that is the actual world in which we live in. And I remember reading that particular book, and I think it was probably like 2008, 2009. So this was like a little before I started getting into all the gaming stuff, but then recognizing that was all sort of a part of it. And then it's messy. I mean, I think that's another thing too, that I always think that when I'm looking at student work, I'm always like, this world feels too neat. Like everything makes too much sense. It's like too constructed, because once you start sending actual people into that construction, then they will start building weirder things and breaking rules and doing all that stuff, because that's the way the world actually kind of works. So I would say that was a big one for me. I was also a huge fan of the Gunslinger series when I was growing up by Stephen King, and that also I think has some pretty cool world building and glimpses, where it doesn't do the big info dump. It just gives you little glimpses of where Roland is going and where he's at and the way that people act, and it's incredibly well done in terms of how it sort of dribbles out the rules of this world, the first book particularly.
That's super interesting. I was thinking about how when I was in middle school, I would just go up to my dad's bookshelf and pull random stuff off of it and start reading it. And a lot of the content that I was reading was not aimed at middle school students,
exactly.
but I think ended up having a pretty dramatic effect on how I started thinking about the kinds of literature I consumed. Like, I remember being in 6th grade, I had read Jurassic Park and A Lost World, both of which Michael Crichton was talking about systemic issues like hypercapitalism and how these institutions fail and what is science all about. One of my favorite parts about that book, even to this day, is the fact that he starts with Ian Malcolm's paradigm shifting idea in the very beginning, and it starts as one piece of a fractal that doesn't unfold until you get further and further in the book. And I remember that being incredibly powerful for me as a kid, although I did pronounce the word paradigm as paradigm because I didn't know what I was reading.
That's the correct pronunciation in rural Connecticut.
That's it. It started to shape my thinking about how these systems interacted with each other. At the same time, I was reading things like Animal Farm and 1984 and Of Mice and Men, all of which, like, I was, 11 or 12 years old, not really grasping what I was reading, but also it started to set off some of the chain reaction that led to me becoming interested in this other stuff. And then by the time I get to college, I've read A Brief History of Time, and I've gotten really into the idea that the world is very big and complicated, and there are all these questions we can't answer. And I think that's what really spurred me. It was okay, so these people are trying to cut a slice of reality and give me an impression of it, but then there are all of these systems, as you said, kind of like in our episode where we talked about simulations and I mentioned Dwarf Fortress, where at some point, when I'm reading about Thomas Aquinas in my college philosophy class, I'm thinking about the prime mover being the equivalent of somebody who's playing Dwarf Fortress. They hit start and then the dwarves do their thing and then the universe sort of unfolds. And so there was this weird overlap of sort of my religious understanding with my scientific understanding, with my literary understanding. And all of that was sort of being wrapped up in philosophy. And I didn't take a single psychology class until I got to my PhD program, which was another piece of this. Like, I really wanted to know how human cognition worked, but I had never taken a psych course.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So that ended up being really central to all of it. But all the psych courses I took were influenced by the instructional design classes I had gotten when I was getting my teaching certification. So by the time I went back to school to start studying psych, I had already gotten a lot of the philosophy, but without the lens or the framework of psychology to inform what exactly that philosophy meant for application in a classroom setting. I had mentioned Mike Young earlier. Not only did he give me Jerome Bruner, but he also pointed me at a lot of the people he knew, like David Jonassen, the late David Jonassen, who was an instructional design scholar who was on my comp committee and unfortunately passed away not long after. But he wrote the book Learning to Solve Problems, which is all about how do you create these ill-defined problem-based learning environments. In addition to that, I read Cognition in the Wild by Hutchins, which is all about this situated perspective of how people problem solve in the real world. Similar with Lev and Wenger, I talked about the situated learning book all throughout the world building workshop, as well as a number of these episodes. All of those things started to stack on top of one another and create the kind of spiral curriculum that Jerome Bruner had written about, which led to me reading one of his best books, which is Actual Minds, Possible Worlds, which is very dense. Like, it's not an easy, light summer read. It's a difficult psychological, philosophical book, but it's incredibly helpful for explaining how all of this fits together. And then I was synthesizing that with Jim G's book, which, to your point, never was about how to take a game and use it in a classroom. It was just exploring the idea that games happened to be very good at teaching, and maybe we should learn something from that.
Yeah.
I think you and I are in agreement that when we started going to GLS, one of the biggest frustrations we had was the sheer number of people who completely misunderstood and misrepresented what that book actually said.
Exactly.
So I think all of these things started to feed into one another. I was reading Gibson and Gibson, who talked about eco-psych. That's in the book, so I'm not going to rehash it here. But all of these pieces start fitting together. And then I learn about the other people who were studying similar things, like Sasha Barab and Kurt Squire. Now, I don't know how many people listening to this are academics and know how academic lineage works, but scholarship is actually a pretty tightly knit, small community. Like, if you study a specific thing, odds are there are only at most a couple dozen people in the world studying that same thing. And you probably all know each other, or at least know of one another. Mike was also the major advisor to Sasha. So Sasha and I share an academic scholarly lineage with Mike Young, who learned from John Bransford. He was one of John Bransford's graduate students, or worked with John Bransford at Vanderbilt University in the 80s and 90s. So all of the things that I was reading about were coming out of this one specific lineage of psych and philosophy and education that remain connected today. Kurt Squire was Sasha's graduate student. So all of the things that they were doing and I was reading about, I was also sort of a participant in that, insofar as we had the same source material we were working from, with the same advisor who was giving us the same kinds of goals in terms of what we were studying. So it really was this very particularly structured environmental context where we were predisposed to looking at the world in a certain way because of the things that brought us to Mike in the first place. Like, whenever anyone asks me about applying to a graduate program, a PhD program, the most important thing I tell them, well, there's two. One, don't ever get a PhD because you want anyone to call you doctor, because that's just not.
And they hardly ever do.
And they hardly ever do it. But the second and more important thing is, when you apply to a program, you are not applying to a university, you're applying to a person. And you need to make sure that you are aligned with the advisor who's going to be able to best advise you based on your specific interests. So it was just serendipity that Mike Young happened to be at the University of Connecticut, and I happened to be in Connecticut, having gone there formerly as an undergrad and as a master's student. The fact that I was able to work with him just worked out. Like, it was just a really great coincidence that he was studying the same kinds of things I wanted to study, which meant I didn't have to uplift my entire life to go do this thing.
Yeah.
I could just shift gears and move from teaching at a high school that was 20 minutes away from the university to being a grad student at the university. And as soon as I made that switch, it just felt natural for all of these things that have been coalescing for 10 years to finally come together for me to be able to say, this is what I want to do with my life. This is the thing that I really care about. And I have a very clear idea of why I care about that thing.
Yeah, and it's funny too, because I mean, looking back, like you're giving the rich version of the history, and I'm looking back too, where it's like thinking now, where I'm an English PhD, but I took a ton of history, and I basically double minored in history and philosophy, and could have triple majored if I had played my cards right in English history and philosophy. But before that, when I was growing up as a kid, I was writing down. Like, of course, Star Wars and Indiana Jones were super influential when I was, I born in 74, so 70s and 80s. But I remember Cablevision was in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and there were movies that I wasn't supposed to be watching because they were rated R after 7 o'clock. And I always think these are like the golden four movies are Excalibur, which is a retelling of the King Arthur story, Blade Runner, of course, the original Blade Runner, The Road Warrior, fantastic still, and then The Terminator. And this would have been 1982, 1984, which would have meant I was 8 to 10 years old watching these, right? So it's fairly young. But then also I was huge into comic books, huge into tabletop role-playing games, and I also devoured all kinds of literature, not just speculative fiction, but like all kinds of stuff. And then when I ended up getting to college, because I grew up as a nothing, no religion, I was really interested in religion and wondering why all my friends who were Catholics were having difficulty with guilt and whatever. I'm like, I don't have any of that stuff, right? So I ended up taking sociology, religion, philosophy of religion, intro to philosophy, and then started getting into social philosophy as well, like governmental. It's funny because I ended up taking social philosophy, which is, I thought it was going to be about like being a social person as opposed to sort of government structures. It was much more about government structures, and ended up learning a lot in that particular class about how, during the Enlightenment, all these ideas, if you could design a government, how would it work or whatever. And just looking back, like thinking about that while reading things like Chaucer and Milton's Paradise Lost. And that's when I got into Tolkien for the first time, was when I read the Silmarillion, which is also very much like reading the Old Testament or reading Paradise Lost or whatever.
Did you read the Silmarillion before Lord of the Rings?
I'd read it when I was in, junior high or high school or whatever, and it didn't have that much of an impact on me. And then I read the Silmarillion my sophomore year of college and thought, okay, now like this is utterly fascinating, right? So then I had to go back, and then that's when I really got deep into Tolkien from that point. But that's all to sort of say. And then like going up through grad school, I was like, I need a job, right? So it's like, there was a 10-year gap between when I was an undergrad, but it was always basically like, even when you're looking at Paradise Lost or you're looking at the Canterbury Tales, those aren't like straight up literature, right? Like, like if you're reading Hemingway or you're reading, especially this is where so many instructors are really caught up on modernist fiction, 20th century fiction as being like the God's send of all literary whatever. And I was never, I was always interested in the magic and always interested in other, Frankenstein and Dr. Faustus and things like that, that had these science fictional or unrealistic, because I think that's where, just growing up, I'm like, why am I the only one who's constantly rejecting reality around me, right? And then I think engaging with that stuff was a huge Icelandic sagas, and like just getting into other world mythologies and things like that. And I was a sort of a fan of Joseph Campbell for a while, which grad school beat that out of me. But thinking just specifically about how the world makes sense. And I think, we've talked a lot about this too. You're spit out into the world by your parents and your DNA slurry is what it is, right? And it's like, oh, well, I think both of us have always felt sort of outside whatever the main narrative, whatever the grand narrative is about what your life is and what you're supposed to be doing, what your country is, and all those other kind of things, never sat well with me, even when I was a little kid. And basically my entire life has been finding ways to put words and language to what I'd always sort of been thinking and feeling about the world. And then that then shifts into, oh, everything is just made up. Right? Humans have made up all of this stuff. So if we can make it, we can unmake it, and we could make it in different or better ways, right? And then it's like, okay, so that's where even, going through this creative process of saying like, okay, you're writing fiction, and your fiction should be saying things. Like I remember we read one work, and I can't remember the name of it. It was on Tor.com, but it was a mermaid who was going back and forth between land and the sea to like, pull off this heist or whatever. But it was very much a metaphor for being trans. Like you're moving between these two worlds all the time. And I was like, this is exactly what fantasy allows you to do, is allows you to give you a metaphorical story about that, right? And it feels like as I keep going with this, it's even the need for people to actually critically understand how our world works, what is optional, what is necessary, what is mandatory, and how different people find themselves. Like writing stories about mermaids is great, but I'm more worried about our world going up in flames, because nobody understands what the hell is going on. So veering even more into the critical thinking and empathy stuff is sort of where I'm finding myself now in 2026.
I hadn't even started to consider this as a possibility to include in my list until just now, but I can't help but notice how informative Calvin and Hobbes was for me as a kid.
Yep.
My dad had a bunch of the Calvin and Hobbes anthologies, and I was obsessed. Not because I necessarily saw myself as Calvin. There was a little bit of projecting myself into him, but I didn't have the sort of rambunctious behavioral problems version of ADHD that Calvin did. But I did really, really understand and empathize with the imaginative piece, and that I had a really strong imagination that I very much was the kind of kid who would get a cardboard box and pretend it was a rocket ship or a duplicator or a transmogrifier or whatever. Yeah. That paired with Foxtrot, the comic Foxtrot by Bill Amend, that was hugely influential on me too, because I saw myself in Jason Fox, the youngest of the three kids. One of the things I struggled with, as you were saying, was that I still didn't have at that time language to describe what my experience of the world was, because I could kind of see myself in these characters, but for some reason, like you, was on the outs. Like I was the little sociologist studying everyone around me and not feeling like I was necessarily included. And it wasn't until much later that I realized, and I've had this conversation a number of times now about gender and sexuality, I just didn't know because there were no words, because there were no people around who had that life experience. So I wasn't learning directly from anyone else. I just kind of had to figure it out on my own. And it wasn't until even 2016 that I decided, oh, now I have the language. I am going to live the way that I want to as a queer person, because not only have I worked through the Catholic guilt that you were talking about, like the internalized homophobia and misogyny and all these other things, but also the fact that I was watching as all of these institutional structures that I had been taught were fixed as they started to decay and fall apart. And that had already been something I thought a lot about. Like I said, when I was in college, I was already questioning, or had mostly shed my Catholicism because of the various scandals of the Catholic Church and my inquiry into philosophy and humanism. But the longer that went on, the more untenable it became to believe that these large organizational structures could be persistent, right? That there was inevitably a cycle where things would grow, they'd get to their peak, they would decay, they'd fall apart, they'd be replaced in the sort of phoenix rising and falling and being reborn kind of way. And so when Donald Trump was elected president, I basically just said, fuck it, I'm going to be the person I want to be. I am done adhering to the boundaries that have been drawn by other people who weren't me, or that created a world that wasn't for people like me. And that was another kind of synthesis of these ideas I had studied through high school, college, grad school, figuring out what does the world mean to me and how do I want to experience it? What kind of world would I build for other people? It became very important to me to provide a model of that for my own students, because that didn't exist when I was in school. And I knew that if they could see somebody else living in that world, or at least trying to build that world, that would empower them to do the same thing, as opposed to assuming all of those structures or all of those hierarchies had to be fixed. And so it's weird how intertwined. Maybe it's not weird. It's probably entirely predictable that you would intertwine your identity with your realization of philosophy, psychology, science, falsification,
No,
world
same thing.
building.
I grew up in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and did not love it. Mostly because it would what we would call today. I felt very heavily toxic masculinity. You killed deer, you ate red meat. You talked about the Packer, you worked on your car. And it's like the Packer's the only thing there that I care about at all, right? And this is where going to Madison. And I always say Madison's my heart's home. If someone said you could never go back to Green Bay, I wouldn't think twice about it. If someone said you could never go back to Madison, I would be absolutely heartbroken. And I've spent about as much time in Madison as I have in living in Madison year round as I have in Green Bay. But no, it's very much that where I'm like, oh, there isn't toxic masculinity here. And there are people who aren't Liberace, who, you know what I mean? Like the most gay stereotype. Like there's just regular people who have different sexual preferences, and I never knew that. I didn't know such things existed before, and it was really eye-opening. And I think that that's where I always say Madison is the place where I became me, and it was because it was really the first time in my life that I got validation that the world is not simplistic. These things are very, all the systems under which we live have been created by humans at a certain point, at a certain time, for certain reasons, right? And I mean, I think this is why, too, like one of the things that drives me crazy whenever I'm talking to people who think diversity, oh, well, you just need a quota or whatever, you know what I mean? So we got to throw somebody, whatever. And it's like, well, no, and I think this is where I've got deep sympathies for this is, the world that was built in the economic expansion of post-World War II in the United States was meant for quote unquote everybody, but it really was all geared towards white men, right? So it's like the world that got built out, the benefits ran heavily towards white men, and I'm a beneficiary of that. My dad was able to, and grandfathers were able to take advantage of that as well. But I really think that throughout the civil rights era and then through the 70s, it's like, wait a minute, in order to build a better future and a world that is going to actually work for the majority, you need representative examples in those conversations at the get-go, right? That's and it's the same thing when we're looking back at the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. It's like, oh, well, this is freedom for man, and by man we don't mean woe-man, and we don't mean slaves, and we don't mean non-landholder man, and we don't mean, right? And it's like, well, wait a minute, which do you actually mean? Is it for everybody? Is it a universal, or is it selective? So humans have always been doing this, and I think this is where, I think I said this a couple shows ago, that the people who are in power don't want anyone thinking that it's ever been any different. That threatens their power. And every time I think about what world, what is the heritage in which we are living? And it's pretty much at this stage, post-World War II, Cold War is the world in which we are living in right now. And I think it's shifting to something different. And I don't know what that's going to be, but it's basically that entire world of the 80s and 90s, I think, is falling down around us in the early part of the 21st century. And it's going to be somewhere around here is the end of the era, and it turns into something new. And I don't know what that's going to be. Maybe AI.
I do think there was one moment in high school where I read Albert Camus' The Stranger that really opened my eyes to the possibility that all of this stuff was malleable. And I remember at the time somewhat rejecting the premise of that book, existentialism. It basically is thinking this is such a nihilistic way to live your life that nothing matters. And even at the end of the book, he's basically unrepentant about everything that happened and is yeah, well, shit happens. That's life. And the older I've gotten, the more I've come to understand, oh, it is all correct. That philosophy is correct in some sense, but the response to it being absurdism is also a thing I've really adopted. The idea that it all works this way and is made up and that the points don't matter, but you can respond to that. You have agency. And I think that was the piece that was missing back when I read that book initially. And none of this was what we talked about in my high school English class. I took AP English multiple times, in different strands, the world literature, the American literature, whatever. We didn't really ever talk about that stuff. It was almost always authorial intent. What was meant by that word? Why did they include this imagery? It was never how do you interpret this or synthesize it with your own identity and lived experience. And that was the piece that grad school helped with, that it centered my understanding of reality more than it did the authorial intent of other people who had come before me.
Yeah, exactly.
And I can see why that's really scary to people, because it forces you to reckon with decisions you've made, ways you've experienced the world. It's the same, you've said this before too, it's the same reason why higher education is under attack, it equips people to be able to ask questions that threaten existing power structures.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
it's not anyone indoctrinating anybody. It's giving them the resources necessary to be able to ask, who am I and how do I fit into this giant mess that we call reality? Which is,
Yeah.
again, one of the reasons why I fell in love with Jerome Bruner's narrative psychology and world building specifically as areas of study. You know, I love ecopsych, I love situated cognition, but specifically Bruner was the one who made me think, wow, there's this really cool way to understand why people do the things that they do. And that layered on top of the structures and substructures of the world building template really clarified for me the fact that as much as we believe that there's such a thing as free will, you can only push that so far because
yeah.
everybody's free will is inherently constrained by the world they're born into, the family they're a part of. And if you really do mesh with those structures, if you really do mesh with that hierarchy, of course you don't want that to change.
Right.
Because, as you said, with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, if you're a white man, yeah, it's bad for you, theoretically, if other people have power, because then you have to share it. And it's an inherently selfish way of thinking about the world. That was the part that, upon deconstruction, made life feel infinitely more livable for me, that I wasn't as depressed, I wasn't as anxious. It was liberating to be able to look at the world that I felt like I hadn't belonged in and say, oh, it's not me that's broken. It's the fact that the world was designed in a way that it was never going to be accommodating for me. And I needed to figure out, how do I do something about that? Which is the reason why instructional design appealed to me. It's the reason I love teaching. It's the reason I love advising. It's the reason I love writing books like this one. I was going to suggest to people that if they haven't read it, you might look up The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman, which is not about any of this. It's not a deeply psychological, philosophical book. It's just a practical application of how do you design stuff that makes sense. And that paired with my understanding of how people learn, how people think, how we make sense of who we are, gave me the toolbox necessary to be able to go to other educators and say, hey, look, I know this is the curriculum you need to build. I know these are the learning objectives you're working on. How can we do this in a way that is going to allow students to see themselves in this stuff? Much in the same way that earlier narrative approaches to instruction, like The Adventures of Jasper Woodbury or like Pappert's Logo, tried to bring students in and make them the owners of their learning, not position the teacher as the center of learning.
And that's kind of what, too, even when I was going to, I was a little bit anxious, going to grad school and saying, I've not read all these, great books or whatever. And that was also the sort of the realization. I think I had a couple of advisors who sort of nudged me in that direction, that you're never going to be able to do the cataloging, of everything and have an opinion on everything. So don't even worry about it. Like, that's impossible to do. And if someone's like, oh, well, have you read this or that? You say, no, have you read this or that? Because they won't have read it, And then, you're back on even ground. But I think that that's one of the things that idea of having agency is also, if you can make a fictional world and you can see how it works and you understand how our world has worked far enough along, then you can start to see, oh, well, maybe we need to tweak it over here, or maybe we need to tweak it over here. And this is one of the things that I really resent is too strong of a word, but sort of like the 90s, I'm okay, you're okay kind of thing. Like, oh, well, yeah, we'll just recognize that you're black and I'm white and that I've got money and that you've got less money. And just recognizing that is good enough. And it's like, yeah, but then when you go to that next level and it's like, well, why does that correlate so heavily that I'm white with money? And like, why did that happen? And then you start reverse engineering how we got here. And this is where I was thinking too, like if somebody threw sticky, ugly social issues or problems to me, I can't imagine anything that I wouldn't be able to then somehow fit into my existing understanding of how the world works, Where it's like, so you can't get like somebody likes to do this or this is whatever. It's like, it doesn't matter what corner of the world. It's like, if I do a little research, I would just understand, well, I could see where this comes from. So even really ugly things like white nationalism in this moment, like I can go back and deconstruct where I think white nationalism comes from, which has economic causes. It has to do with lack of demographic distribution around the country, having a cheap scapegoat, all those kind of things. I don't condone it, but at least I understand why people in rural areas would find some solace in white nationalism. So then the question is, how do you cut off the things that make that an appealing option? If you want to rid ourselves of white nationalism, we don't just round up and eliminate those people. We eliminate the cause of what makes people feel like that is out there in the world, as opposed to people who I think have very strict often religious understandings of how the world works that are very rigid. And then it's like, well, you can't do that because that shatters my worldview. And if they do this, this is going to prove that my belief is wrong or whatever. It's like, right. See, but that's your life. And I'm not living by the rules that you're living by just because you think they're important. Right. And I think that that's also where it's like, what am I if I'm not a man who likes to shoot deer and eat their heart out? You know what I mean? And like love to, rough up women and, whatever. Like, am I even a man? And it's like, oh, well, no, you just got to get around broader thinking people and you will realize that that is an idiot's impression of what a man can be or could be or should be. But, those things take time. And again, it's one of those things that if I go back to Green Bay and I'm like, oh, well, no, I'm a feminist and whatever, then it's like, I don't think it's gotten all that much better. You know what I mean? Like, I can't imagine going to a bar on a Saturday night and having a conversation with an enlightened, guy, a random guy, I'm sure. And I've got my friends who work in and around Green Bay, and they're like, no, it's still pretty toxic masculine, right? So that was a world that I escaped and got out of and really don't like going back to.
There's an interesting corollary here to another set of readings that I would recommend to anyone who's listening to this. We did talk a little bit about them when Mike Young was on, and they're specifically in reference to the Clark-Kozma debate about media use in educational environments. So the first paper is the 1983 Richard Clark position that everything that we do with technology is as a vehicle for distributing information. And the response to it is the 1991 Learning with Media piece by Robert Kozma, where the argument is basically like, this is all artificial. These are specific affordances or capabilities of a medium that matter a lot more than the technology itself. And the reason why I'm bringing this up in this context is because the outcome of that debate wasn't really about any one technology or even education. It was more about reframing the conversation about science. And it was about, how do we understand the world? Is it this rigid binary where a thing is or it isn't? Or should we instead be thinking about the effects of a thing, how specific kinds of representations or interactions or affordances can be leveraged in a specific way to cause some specific outcome? And it's the same basic framework that we had used in the 2012 Review of Ed Research meta-analysis that Mike and I had worked on, Our Princesses in Another Castle, where we concluded by saying, asking the question, are video games good or bad for education, is a stupid question.
A stupid question, yeah.
You need to be asking the more situated, targeted question of, does this specific game with these particular affordances, is that going to be more or less effective in this specific environment for these particular learners? It's not about the video game itself. And this gets back to the Jim G piece that united us in our scholarship. It's not about games being deployed in the classroom because they're fun. It's about, how do games afford learning opportunities for specific kinds of learners to be able to walk away with a better understanding of insert learning objective here.
Right.
So that's the thing that sort of threads it all together. The Clark-Kozma debate being more about how rather than whether, and then being able to walk that back to all of these other philosophical, psychological, technological concepts that feed into the broader question of, how do you fix institutions that are broken? How do you even recognize that an institution isn't doing the thing you want it to do?
Yeah. And that's, it reminds me, it's funny too, because like as we come to these things and I'm thinking about other things that I'd read, and I remember there's I think it was just a very long article, Pedagogy of Multiliteracies, Designing Social Futures by the New London Group. And what they were sort of arguing was that we need to engage more with multimodal forms of experimenting. And this was basically from sort of Rhett Comp angles, right? So this is where, why shouldn't they be doing video essay as opposed to just writing the traditional, whatever. And it was basically that same kind of thing where it said, hey, the world's changing. The students that are coming through have been exposed to different types of literacies, different kinds of media literacies their entire lives. And if they're not seeing that in their home, if they're not seeing what they actually see in the world in our classes, that's a problem, right? Like that's the world in which they've already been learning and seeing. And if we just relegate all that stuff to, oh, well, that's just TV or that's just, video games or whatever. And it's more or less, it's what you were just saying. But from this group, they're like, oh, well, we all have these different levels of literacies for different forms of media. And what we need to be doing is thinking harder about not saying, because back in the day, back in, the early, this was, I think that was written in the early 90s, mid 90s. And I started grad school in 2006 or whatever. But it was still very much that literature specifically in an English department was not just but the repository for culture, right?
Hmm.
And like maybe some really good films could get in, but really we just needed to stick to the
Hmm.
canon of literature, right? And I'm like, what? But does that again, it's that whole, like you were saying before, it is that canonical or whatever you want to call it, that it's like, oh, well, that's what you're going to need to learn. And until you learn that, you will be deficient. And this is the
Hmm.
exact same turning it around where, oh, well, there are different kinds of things that students are going to need to learn. What are the different types of literacies? What are the different types of modalities we could bring
Hmm.
to allow them to experiment, to better understand themselves, right? And like get some experiment, get some trials here. Like, have you ever done an audio, like a podcast? Have you ever tried doing a video essay, whatever? And then people will find, oh, I had no idea that you could do something. I could express myself in this way. And it's like you say, this is the part that's so frustrating when we get into these, I'll just call them dumb arguments about education. I understand that you don't want to fund this, and our current systems do not allow us to do this in the ways that we would like. But that doesn't mean that they're wrong, right? It means that it's actually that the
Hmm.
system is wrong. And then the question, like this is one of my favorite little catchphrases over the last, I don't know, 20 years, is in this race between reform and collapse. What's ahead?
Hmm.
And it seems like collapse is always winning because reform takes too much time and costs too much money and doesn't have guaranteed results. So we're just going to keep plodding forward with what we know doesn't work. And that's the stuff that drives me absolutely nuts when we know something doesn't work and we're unwilling to do what it takes to actually fix it. And instead, we're just going to keep going with the status quo, which I think, again, is a very conservative sort of viewpoint on how you approach the world, as opposed to let's radically remake it so it works for more people. Now that we recognize who all those people are, yeah, I don't know. That's
Which is
yeah, good.
It's just funny because as you were talking, I was thinking to myself, I don't want to make it sound like these ideas about playful learning or constructivism didn't exist until the 80s or
Yeah,
90s because they're not new. Like
right.
John Dewey wrote about discovery learning in Experience in Education in the early 20th century.
Yep.
And it's not as though apprenticeship did not exist for centuries beforehand. Or if you go back even further, the Socratic method is a
Yeah.
really good example of how to get people to introspect, to interrogate their beliefs, think about their fit in the world. It just lends credence to what you're saying about the difficulty of reform, that
Yeah.
these ideas aren't strictly new. They are old and they are tested, and we know that they work. It's just very difficult to change the systems that they are embedded in because those
Right.
systems are themselves resistant to reform because reform is a threat to status quo. And if you are a beneficiary of the status quo, of course you don't want the system to change.
Right.
But eventually things do collapse and then
Yeah.
you have to replace them. It's just a question of would it have been better to let that collapse happen and do the replacement, or should you have tried to head it off at the pass with some kind of reform? There's a
Right.
climate change analog here somewhere, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was thinking too, like even when we talked last time, and I was thinking about societies that didn't have any written language.
Hmm.
And we always view that as being primitive or whatever, right? But if you don't have a written language, then that means everything's being transmitted orally. And there can't be much that's more fluid than an
Mm.
oral storytelling tradition, right? So you don't need to remake your institutions because a law was codified in language, right? It's like
Hmm.
you don't need to do any of that. Yeah, and I think there's a problem probably with scaling that kind of thing, which
Hmm.
again, it's like, well, just because we scaled into mega cities, and whatever. Have you ever thought that maybe that's not what a group of mostly hairless apes should have done? Like maybe the tribal road was the way to keep things a little bit more organized. And I think that those are all very, you'd say this at a faculty meeting and people look at you like you've grown a second head, right? But that's really, I think, the fundamental, like, how did we get here? Well, we got here through a series of developments around the world, right? And it's like, so who's to say, like, oh, well, we've always thought, oh, well, writing is way better and being able to go back and having, books and history and whatever. And it's like, well, but part of that too, couldn't that be seen as a burden? Like if you never had to worry about it, right? Like if you never
Hmm.
had to worry about where these laws came from because the laws made sense to everybody because they make sense for us today, right? Would be a very different. But I guess that's where in a tribal society too, you're not trying to be radically diverse and incorporate lots of people from different cultures. You're just You got your culture, and that's the way you're going to do it. And maybe if you don't like it, then you have to leave. Not to say that's the other part is like you can't romanticize these other forms. This is the social philosophy coming out. You can't romanticize other forms either, right? I'm sure they would have done just as many problems or different problems or whatever it is, but it's still, for me, fun to sort of think through. And that's again where speculative fiction and fantasy come in, is build an alternate world where they don't have any written word and it's all oral, and we'll do a little mind experiment through fiction of how we think that would work.
Yeah, the thought experiment piece, I think, is really important. And there's a thesis in all of what we've been saying. I think it's that all of the philosophy, psychology, creative writing, language, etc., culminates in world building as a philosophical or psychological framework,
And
or at least a
an
framework
activity, yeah.
yeah, it's both an activity and a framework for understanding reality. Because like you, I now feel like I have a way to be able to understand all these different perspectives and ways of living that I probably couldn't have conceptualized when I was a teenager because it was just too much information.
Too much information.
But if you can work backward to this sort of macro level 4X game style of understanding reality, you can zoom in or out as far as you need to and be able to apply this as a methodology to go, okay, well, like I can see the pattern. It's the Ian Malcolm Jurassic Park paradigms, right?
Yeah,
it's
the paradigm.
The fractal paradigms, these ideas that things do scale in certain ways and that those patterns will inevitably repeat, and that just because a specific pattern exists now doesn't mean it has to exist the same way next time around. As we often say, history doesn't repeat, it just rhymes. And so every time there's a new version, we can recognize the things that are similar or different and then use that invariance to make decisions about what direction do we go next. When I think about how did I get here as a scholar of world building or a scholar of interactive narrative, it's more or less because I wanted to make sense of the world that I'm embedded in.
Exactly.
And this was a way for me to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's what I would say too, that my sort of impulse, so it's one of the things that I've realized over the years too, is that I know lots of folks in creative writing who are writers, right? Like they really like print literature. They really like print poetry, which I think is fantastic. I've got nothing against that, right? And the thing is that I'm always thinking, okay, but what do we do for the very many of our students who aren't as interested in that, right? Like we can't force them to take those interests on board. But yeah, very much like pulling apart or adding new stuff to the world and then figuring out what would happen then, I think was probably like a coping mechanism for somebody who felt out like a fish out of water, right? And that's where it's like, oh, well, that seems like to be a totally normal way of real, thinking through, well, if it was built this way, what if it was built in a different way, right? And that's, and again, that's, I'm sure that's not how a lot of people think, but I can hardly keep one foot in reality most of the time. I'm a dreamer thinking about other big different world-changing events rather than worrying about, do I have enough milk for tomorrow?
I don't know. We somehow have to keep both things in the back of our head all the time. But that's the benefit of being neurodivergent, I guess, is that you never have a choice. You only get to have six trains of thought at the same time.
Exactly.
So I think we're coming to the end here.
Yep.
I thought a nice way to wrap this up would be a recommendation or two for things somebody should read. And I'll hand it to you first. I don't know if there's anything specific that comes to mind. I'm going to pick something we haven't already talked about, but if you want to reinforce one of the books that you suggested earlier, that's fine too.
I'll throw a couple out there. I mean, one, too, that is maybe it's similar to what we were talking about, but Ian Bogost's Procedural Rhetoric, I remember also had a very big impact on me and thinking specifically, I mean, that's mostly about video games and using video games for different kinds of approaches in advertising and politics or whatever. But really being able to think about the choices that people make when they're making a game really made me think about instructional design as well, and thinking about, well, what's the procedural rhetoric involved in my syllabus and my classes and things like that. So I think that's a really good one to look at. I'd already mentioned second person, but the first person, second person, and third person series from MIT Press is all excellent. It's all about new media, stories, performance, game, world building, stuff like that. And then Dawn of Everything, which I'd mentioned in a previous show, David Wengrow and David Graeber. It's a book that is also really thought-provoking. It's basically saying, what if we take all of these assumptions that we can't really verify and put them up against head-to-head all of these other assumptions that we can't verify, yet we take as fact. And I love that kind of approach where it's like, well, no, this isn't what happened, but it's just as possible that this is the way it happened as anything else that we take as history. So those are a couple that I will throw out there that I think are really good for teaching, for world building, and for basically this, how do you place yourself in this world and understand it?
I think those are some really good options. I have a couple as well, although I feel kind of guilty because I know there are going to be some that I leave out that are
Yeah,
absolutely
well,
critical if you want to understand how the world works. I'm going to put them into two different columns or baskets. First are some of the academic things we've discussed on other episodes. For example, A Time for Telling by Dan Schwartz and John Bransford. Again, John Bransford being one of the faculty responsible for the Jasper Woodbury series and Anchored Instruction. I think that's a really helpful context for understanding why direct instruction isn't always a bad option. It just needs to be scaffolded in a way that allows for inquiry and discovery so that students have the appropriate context to understand what they're being told. The second is Analogical Problem Solving, the 1980 paper by Mary Gick and Keith Holyoake, which I have discussed in previous episodes. It's all about transfer and why transfer does or doesn't happen. Of course, there's our fan favorite American Nations by Colin Woodard, which we somehow didn't mention
yeah, I know. I was
all
going
of
to
this
say,
conversation.
ridiculous.
It's a miracle. But Colin Woodard's work is fascinating and helpful for doing the world building or construction of culture that we often talk about. But there are two others that I want to strongly recommend for anyone interested in this line of thinking or research. The first is John Seely Brown, Alan Collins, and Paul Duguid's Situated Cognition and the Culture of Learning, which is probably the single most influential article I've ever read for my own research. It is all about situated learning and how and why knowledge is doing, not a thing that's stored in your head. So if you're really interested in situated cognition or you want to better understand inquiry-driven learning and the benefits of it, that is the article I would point you to. The last thing I'll mention is completely unrelated to psychology and philosophy. It's a book called The Gene and Intimate History by Siddhartha Mukherjee, which is a biography of genetics. It's all about how the history of genetic engineering, genetic research evolved over time, who the major players were, what the implications are for the future of science. And so if you're interested in the philosophy of science or anything really having to do with the scientific method, the Enlightenment, it's a really, really great book that tells a compelling history of where all of that came from and why it's so valuable to humanity.
Yeah, that's all great. I think too that one of the things that we can highlight as a truism here is that we can't really plan any of this, right? Like it's sort of like jambalaya. You bring whatever you're gonna, you bring whatever you have and you throw it in the pot at the end of the day, and that's what you cook up together and hope the flavors kind of come together. But yeah, I've been working with both a graduate student a little bit and now this undergrad who's interested in learning, sort of like doing his own, assembling his own sort of undergraduate degree. And it's fun to go back and think about where all of this stuff came from. And when I actually, had much more time to be, articulate about my course designs and things like that. So yeah, this was a fun throwback. And I think the other thing too that's remarkable is a lot of this stuff is aged remarkably well. Like, a lot of these things are from the early 2000s and they're just as true now. But this is where some of the bullshit that I've had to deal with before isn't this all just a flash in the pan? It's like, this is the latest, whatever educational craze. And it's like, well, no, like if you actually know, like some of it, sure. But like if you actually know why this is working, it's like, no, what good it does us. You know what I mean? Like the institutions aren't changing, but you as an individual, and I mean, this is what we wrote in the book as well. Like we're not expecting this to change the world and change the system of education in the United States. But if you're being driven crazy, by your classes and what you're trying to do, then maybe this is an effective way of actually getting to what all of our idiotic standardized tests are trying to train people to do, which is, think.
Which is the dichotomy that you get when you have one misrepresentation of Jim G's book versus the actual intent of Jim G's book.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a good way to tie off this knot, is just to say, first, go read Jim G's book. I think that's, if you haven't done that already, that's a great starting point for playful learning. But the flash in the pan stuff is the misrepresentation of that. It's the, I'm going to make an app that teaches kids and that's going to replace teachers, as opposed to the more central point he was making, which is about the lineage of this scholarship and what it means for future designers, future thinkers, in terms of what from the 1970s, 80s, 90s we learned about how people actually learn and what could be done to make teaching and learning environments, even if they're micro environments like a single classroom,
Right.
more effective for individual learners and educators.
It makes me wonder, like when you say that, if maybe there isn't some sort of economic model that really foregrounds the importance of immediate gratification and then ruins things as they go longer and longer because they weren't intended to ever be done for anything other than one person to make a fast buck. I wonder if there's anything.
Something.
I wonder if there's anything to
maybe if we could personalize or privatize the gains and then socialize the losses.
I was just going to say that's socialism, and that's why it's bad.
Yeah,
that's why it's
right.
bad. So there you go.
Socialist, communist, Marxists in higher ed.
Yeah, no, selling apps to school districts. That's what Marx had envisioned, was tech bros selling apps to school districts. That is the fundamental core of Marxism.
Karl Marx, Mark Zuckerberg. I don't know. I see something there.
Ooh.
Mark Zuckerberg.
Let's write an AI novel with the main characters, Karl Marx Zuckerberg.
Perfect. I think that's a great place to end it. Please read our new novel forthcoming about Karl Marx Zuckerberg.
And Claude, who doesn't have a last name, is going to be one of the co-authors. So
Claude Musk. Perfect.
I don't even like saying that. No, I need to go take a shower. Okay.
As always, great to see you.
Thanks
to see you. Great conversation.
This was a fun conversation. A trip down memory lane.
And you can go back to pondering your cursed orbs.
I will.
Oh, okay.
All right. See you later.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Auf Wiedersehen.
The Worldbuilding Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenrader and Steven Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Steven Slota. The companion text, The Worldbuilding Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Print copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Steven Slota, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.